Delighted to have Professor James Galbraith of the University of Texas on Global Money Talk today. Professor Galbraith is the Lloyd Benson Chair of Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs and an award-winning professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin. He was executive director of the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress and an economist for the House Banking Committee. From 1993 to 1997, he served as the chief technical advisor for the macroeconomic reform to the State Planning Commission of the People's Republic of China. In 2022, he was elected to the Russian Academy of Sciences, and in 2023 to the Lisbon Academy of Sciences. He has written a number of books on inequality and economic crises. His latest book introduces a new economic framework called Entropy Economics. He is a Marshall Scholar, a life member of the Council of Foreign Relations and the Texas Philosophical Society. He holds degrees from Harvard and a PhD from Yale. Dr. Galbraith, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
We have a lot to talk about, but the first burning question is, you have degrees from Harvard and Yale, so you're a Harvard man or a Yale man?
It was a long time ago, and I now consider myself to be a Texas professor.
Hook 'em horns. That's a great answer. A book on entropy economics, which is a really interesting framework, new framework that looks at things a different way than I think, as you mentioned, most undergraduates are taught economics. So can you give us the viewers a brief overview of entropy economics and maybe an example to help them grasp what it is, or however you want to do that, an example first and then
Well, I think you mentioned undergraduates, and I think the common experience of undergraduates who are exposed to elementary economics is that they really, at some gut level, understand that it's a dead subject. It's about two stable forces. They call one demand and the other supply. They intersect. They give you price and quantity. This is what the market is supposed to do. And once you're there, you're in equilibrium and you just stay there. An idea which was very, let's say, in conformity with established views from the time of Confucius to the French Revolution, practically every other sphere of thought since then. It is not compatible with the way we think of biology in modern terms, and since the middle of the 19th century, it's not compatible with physics since the late 19th century at the latest. It's not compatible with the way in which we live our lives, because we know that we are all part of a living process. And so what we try to do in entropy economics is to put that living foundation under economies as well. They're not really subject to different rules, to fundamentally different rules from living things or mechanical processes. They all rely on high quality, low entropy resources. They have to get those with enough extra energy to be usable. And they have to do that. In order to do that, they have to have structures. They have to make investments. That's true if a leaf wants to photosynthesize the sunlight. It's true if an animal or a human being wants to eat. It's true of for any kind of mechanical process, and it's true for societies as a whole. So we simply apply that same framework to the basics of economics. And exchange is not the foundation, not the central activity. Production is the first thing you have to have, because if you haven't produced anything, you can't have nothing to exchange. So we take up that question. In order to produce, you have to have some sense that there's economic value in what you're producing. So we take up that question. And those two things, it's not the whole of a restructuring of economic theory, but it gets you a long way toward thinking about the real world, thinking about economics in the real world in a sensible and intuitive fashion.
Different ways that we need to calculate what inputs go in. Is there just a concrete example that people like? Is there something we're pricing incorrectly, for example, that we need to price differently under this new framework?
To give you sort of a very specific example, let's just take the value of a resource, of an energy resource, of oil or natural gas. Those things are highly valued when they're scarce, and they become relatively low valued in economic terms when they're very abundant. It is nevertheless the case that they're either way, they are fundamental to the larger structure of an economy. So we're looking at, in some sense, the question of how things are valued in an economic process, in the marketplace, but we're also looking at what you need to have in order to make the system work from the get-go. And the traditional or this established way of accounting for these things, which is, let's say, the gross domestic product, which is the total sum of expenditures in the economy, isn't terribly helpful when you come down to it, because it essentially places the same dollar value, the same currency value on every kind of economic activity. Those which are fundamental and those which are, let's just say, they exist because they can and because you have extra resources to be able to afford them. So we tell a story which actually is familiar to my co-author, who's Jing Chen, who lives in northern British Columbia, of a little town called Barkerville in northern in Canada. And Barkerville was once one of the largest, maybe the largest town in western North America. It was a gold mining town. And if you added up all of the activities in that town, the hotels and the saloons and the brothels and whatever else they had, the barbershops and so forth, gold was a very small fraction of the economic activity. But once the ore ran out, there was nothing left. The town was abandoned. And so it's a sense understanding the fundamental role of high quality resources in underpinning economic activity is, I guess, one of the first concrete things that comes out of our book.
Gold was undervalued because it was more than how much you could sell it for, but because it drove so much economic growth and production when it was there and available.
I would just say that the basis of that economy had to be clearly understood to have been the ore deposit that was underground. But if you measured it the way economists have a habit of measure things, then you would have grossly overvalued or overstated the importance of the hotels and so forth, because they had no viability except for the underlying resource extraction activity. And you can go and look at this in any number of much larger current contexts. I think a really very pertinent example right now is what's going on in Europe, where energy costs have gone up dramatically thanks to the disappearance of Russian gas and also the emphasis on renewables, which are relatively high cost, relatively low efficiency, the abandonment in Germany of nuclear energy. And without those low entropy, high quality resources, Germany is deindustrializing because the larger activities, the automobiles, the machine tools, the chemical plants can't be profitable under the let's say, very high resource costs that Europe is now facing.
I want to digress a little bit because we've been just talking about GDP. Is there, and I know you talk about measuring things properly. Should we measure GDP in a different way? Should we weight GDP and sort of, what's more important or what's not? Or does that just get a little too complicated?
Well, it's a very interesting question. This form of accounting was created in the 1930s and 1940s, and for a very specific purpose, which was to make it possible to control the overall level of demand. So it was kind of in line with the ideas of John Maynard Keynes and in line with the necessity of managing an industrial economy in wartime. And those needs that was an appropriate metric for an economy where let's call it the composition of output was substantially industrial, because you could then add up things that were physically produced in a way which was not entirely unreasonable. But that's not the world we live in now. Since roughly 1970, the United States, I don't think there's been a single new manufacturing job on net. And the the proportion of those jobs to the overall employment is now down well below 10%. So what are people doing? Basically, they're trading services of one kind or another. Some of them highly paid, most of them paid in a fairly mediocre way. Now, is that the basis of a strong and viable and sustainable economy? I think the answer to that is pretty clear that it's a very tenuous basis for that, and that what's happened, of course, with the emergence of the manufacturing centers of Asia, Japan, Korea, but especially China, has been that the processes of cumulative development, technical advance, and therefore advances of living standards, the center of gravity has moved across the Pacific. And that's something which, again, the traditional way of thinking about economic measurements is simply is at a loss to take it fully into account.
You mentioned, I want to get back towards entropy a bit because it really is an interesting idea. And you're saying if we sort of let regulation go and we don't have enough guardrails around it, entropy will increase as it increases in the natural world. And if it increases too dramatically economically, it's going to cause us a whole host of problems. So what guardrails would you say that the U.S. or other advanced governments need to put in to contain or manage the entropy in these economic systems?
Okay, let's again draw a contrast between our perspective and that of let's say, the typical economics textbook. The typical textbook, as I said before, is going to put exchange and the market at the center of activity, and that's a set of transactions essentially between private parties. As you get a number of chapters in, they're going to recognize there's such things as social costs, there's such things as public goods, there's such things as externalities. And all of these things then are considered to be market failures, which will justify one or another form of government intervention, that is to say regulation, if the cost of the regulation is below the benefits that you can get. Okay, so that's a way of thinking about it that places government on the sideline, except for all the cases where it's necessary, which turns out to be practically everything. So we say, no, this is not the right way to think about the role of a regulatory mechanism. In fact, in the real world, markets come into existence when there are, and particularly become expansive and sophisticated, when there are appropriate regulatory mechanisms. And you just take any number of examples. The two I always use is that I don't think many of us would use airplanes if there were not air traffic control. I don't think many of us would eat raw vegetables from the market if we did not believe that there was phytosanitary regulation keeping them clean. Well, of course, many people don't. They have to, they cook everything at high temperatures to protect themselves in a way in which an economy with a high level of regulation makes largely unnecessary. So it is regulation in the sense that keeps everything moving and sustainable for as long as possible. And that's very analogous to the way our bodies work. We have regulation of temperature, regulation of blood pressure. It's the way in which our vehicles, our machinery works. Again, temperature and pressure. These things have to be regulated or the systems simply blow up. They melt down, they break down. And that's true of banking systems, it's true of manufacturing systems, it's true of market systems. So we place an appropriate and successful level of regulation as a very fundamental process. And in fact, I would say, that one thing that really basically distinguishes what we like to call an advanced from a less advanced country is the effectiveness and the efficiency and the respect for the regulatory process. That's not to say that all regulations are good. It's not to say the process can't be abused. It's not to say, there's lots of things that can go wrong. But the difference, as anybody I think who's lived in a country with a low living standard and weak regulatory processes knows, you're safer and your life is easier when your water is clean, when everybody stops at red lights, and when you have public safety and all the things that a good regulation will bring you.
Who's done this the best? And I recognize they may not, some countries or some unions may do one part better than the other. So who's got the best practice? Is it the U.S., where you could argue that we've developed a good basis of safety? Like I can go and get arugula salad and not wash it and eat it, and I feel safe. Is it some like China, which manages its sort of markets very carefully, or perhaps something like the European Union, who sort of likes national champions, and some argue might pick winners and losers better. Who's got the right amount of regulation? Or if no one does, what do you think would be an ideal framework?
I'm not sure there is a single ideal framework, but I will say that I think that for an extended period, the U.S. had a very successful regulatory framework. It brought down the level of violence in the society, brought down the level of environmental pollutants. There's the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. This whole is actually just only 50 or 60 years ago. Created a very substantial and safe food chain. That's more than 100 years now. That was a major issue in the early part of the 20th century, the adulteration of meat and other things. So the U.S. worked on this over a long period of time, from the progressive era, the New Deal, the Great Society, and into the Nixon administration and beyond. And then it started pulling back and came under an ethos which became dominant in the Reagan era and beyond, which said, okay, the government needs to get out of the way. So it's been a struggle since then to maintain those standards, and they've undoubtedly declined. But the U.S. still has a very strong legacy of standards. Now, I started going to China in the 1990s. China was emerging at that point from the Maoist era. That had only been 10 or 15 years previously. And one of the things that struck me was that this was a central government that was not very big compared to the United States. Its regulatory reach was really very limited. And as a result, the market development was very chaotic. And you could just see this, driving around. But it was also true of the quality of appliances and the stability of the electrical grid. And you could name any number of things, that the drinkability of water and everything. And I think that one of the things that China did in its manufacturing processes was to import the standards, the product quality standards, from its major markets, which were from the West. In other words, you wanted to sell to Western consumers, you had to meet the standards that were customary and enforced in those markets. And then once you had achieved that, you could produce in volume and bring up the standards in your own country. And I suspect that's actually not only true of China, but it was also true for other countries that came along sooner. So this was a process where regulatory standards essentially spread. I mean, some of them were indigenous, but some of them were imported. And now I'm not at all sure that China's regulatory apparatus is inferior to that of the United States. There may be questions about, the question of the extent to which you want to be surveilled. That's going on everywhere these days, and other issues that come up in this process, particularly in the information age. But in terms of the core elements that assure a relatively easy life, it gives the population a chance to do things that it wants to do in a reasonable security, reasonable opportunity. China's come a long way.
I guess there's no one who has the right model. Everybody needs to sort of tweak it and adjust the models as they go along. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I think adjustment as circumstances require is always the order of the day. You look at the European situation, and I would put it this way, that Europe came along after the Second World War in ways which were sandwiched between the United States of the New Deal and the Soviet Union, which was an alternative model. And it had a number of decades of rapid progress with very strong social institutions that were created and maintained. Then, about the same time that neoliberal doctrines took over in the United Kingdom and were at least announced in the United States, Europe formed this European Union and embedded institutions that whose inspiration was really drawn from classical traditions, what's called ordo liberalism, monetarism in the structure of the central bank, and it has created for itself a confederacy that is increasingly dysfunctional, and in particular, let's put it this way: that in China, as far as I can see, the government is in the hands of people who are experienced public administrators and engineers. Those are fundamental forces. Those are the people who've circulated through the problems of governing at the township and the municipality and the provincial level, and eventually they get promoted to the state level. And there are people who have experience with making systems work, the engineering systems. In the United States, the principal avenues forward into the political space are either through state and local government, they go up through, again, a governing process, or through the law and other things of that nature. But basically, there's a strong local government, which gives us a certain body of people in the federal government who know something about how things work, but who are not necessarily very adept at the international level. In Europe, the political structure seems to be built around permanent, let's say, the permanent politics of parliamentary systems. And these people are, they're fundamentally driven by their ideologies. And so you get this is what's extraordinary about Germany is how does it decide that it can get along without nuclear power and without Russian natural gas and entirely on, almost entirely on windmills in a country where solar power is not so great because there isn't all that much sun, plus American LNG.
Modern industrial economics make costly and heavy use of resources, contributing to waste, a warming climate, rising seas, and falling human fertility. Given the limits on available resources, which policies and new energy sources can mitigate only up to a point, the future of human society is one of smaller populations, shorter lifespans, lower fixed costs, and highly variable costs, and harsher inequalities. Is that a fair assessment of what you think the future in the next 50 to 100 or whatever years holds?
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable summary of a broadly pessimistic outlook, and it's not simply because the resource quality is deteriorating, which may or may not be an enduring phenomenon. But because the way in which we have approached the stresses of the last 50 years has been to place the cost on the one unit that's really responsive to cost, which is the human family. We have resisted coming to grips with the vast bloat of the financial sector, with the concentration of resources in a tiny handful of people, which is in information technology and getting worse all the time, and with the very large commitments to military competition, which is fundamentally wasteful and useless and destructive, and increasingly, in the case of the United States, as I've argued many times, essentially rendered technologically obsolete, things which are committed to certain ways of doing things, which technologies evolved to bypass. All of that, we could make our resource situation much more let's say, abundant for the population. Haven't done that. So what do households do when they're faced with very high fixed costs? And they've become, this is rich countries. It's all rich countries. It's especially true. It's become very much true in Asia as well as in Europe and in the United States. But you have housing costs, you have education costs, you have retirement savings, you have all kinds. You have healthcare costs. You have all kinds of burdens that impinge on the household. And how can you ensure that you can meet those burdens, particularly when, as in the U.S., the one worker family with a good manufacturing job is a thing of the past? Well, both partners or more work. They work at more than one job. They struggle to make the ends meet. And the one thing they can economize on is to have fewer children. Doesn't mean they have none, but the family which has 5 or 6 children is exceedingly rare, and the norm is now 2 or fewer. The average is below 2. And ultimately, that means your population is going to decline. And when your population declines, then all of the infrastructure you've built up for the larger population begins to decay, becomes more and more expensive per person to maintain it, so you don't maintain it all. And things begin to show wear, tear, cracking. And the entropy law begins to play its role. And you end up spending more time and resources caring for your old people, which again means you have less for preschools and schools. And the whole business of raising children becomes yet more expensive. So the process moves in a very dangerous direction for the maintenance of human populations. And if you want to offset that, you really have to focus on it and ask, how can you make this, the life of families more easier, more attractive? And we're not doing that. We haven't done that. So the fertility rates fell with the energy crisis in the early 70s, and they fell again very sharply after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And we're only just beginning to focus on this.
Right. I want to shift a bit. You wrote a book on inequality as well, and inequality. It seems that we almost have an obsession with it, and and perhaps just as much. But I seem to recall it beginning maybe a decade ago. Thomas Piketty wrote a couple of books about inequality, and it became all the rage of the cognoscenti, and everybody couldn't stop discussing it. But you wrote, in your book on inequality, you wrote about generally measuring things properly, and you want to measure that properly. And you actually broke it out. Is it inequality of wealth, inequality of income, sort of the inequality of what? So in your view, what's a good way to measure inequality? Because what we often hear is Gini coefficients or Gini coefficients, and that seems like perhaps not the best way to do it.
Well, a Gini coefficient is just a standard measure. And you can take the way we do it and translate it into Gini coefficients. That's not really the issue. The issue is what sources of information are going to give you reliable and consistent measures so that you can assess what is going on in a country or a region or continent or the whole world at a given time. And of course, there are basically 3 kinds of data. There's survey data, there's tax data, and there's administrative data. Survey data, the problem there is that surveys are expensive and they're not always, there's not a consistent record. There are lots of changes of definition and so forth. So making survey data into something which is coherent is just a huge, huge challenge. Problem with tax data is that income taxes, not every country has it, and tax codes change, and interpretation of tax codes is problematic. So that fad of tax codes tax data, I think, is fading because there's only a limited amount you can do with it. That leaves the third thing, which is what we focused on, administrative data, of which there is an enormous amount, and it's consistent over long periods of time. And what that enabled us to do is to get a sense of the patterns in the world economy. And what we saw, that inequality doesn't always go up. It was, generally speaking, declining in the 1970s, and it goes up dramatically from 1980 to about 2000. And after that, there's kind of a sawtooth pattern across most of the countries of the world. So we put together in a very systematic way a global data set, and you can really learn something about how the world economy works. And the one thing that emerges from it is that inequality within countries, for many of the countries of the world, is determined by the global financial environment in which they find themselves. So if you want to ask what happened in Latin America and Africa in the 1980s, they were hit by a debt crisis. You want to ask what happened in Eastern Europe in the former Soviet Union? Well, it was hit by the collapse of the USSR and the so-called transition, and inequality went up everywhere very, very radically. And then that began to stabilize after about a decade. You want to ask what happened in Asia? Well, you look at the liberalizations that led to and beyond the Asian crisis in 1997. You can see this in the data. Once you've got really good measures, you can see that the global financial system has an enormous influence, not surprisingly, on countries that operate within that system. It determines the balance between what they earn from finance, what they earn from exports, and what the bulk of people who are in the internal economy earn. And that tends to drive the inequality measures. So you begin to get a sense that if you want to control the inequalities, then you need to have control over your country's presence in the financial system. Well, it's no surprise to anybody from the Republic of Korea. This is exactly what happened in 1997. There was a financial liberalization and a crisis. And who did not suffer that crisis? China didn't suffer it. And why didn't China suffer it? China didn't suffer it because China maintained capital controls. And it was not subject to the kind of shock of the flight of capital from Asia because it controlled it. I confess that this was the period when I was in a position to give some advice to the government of China. And this was a point that I brought in people to emphasize. Don't give up your control over capital flow, because this is your national autonomy. This is your sovereignty. And of course, it's easier for a large country to do that than for relatively small ones. Nevertheless, this is why multipolarity is now happening as countries realize that they need to have better insulation of one kind or another, collectively or individually, from the instabilities of the global financial system. And that, I find that a very interesting but also intellectually congenial result, because it really fits with Hyman Minsky's understanding, with Keynes, of how the world system works, in which you live in a monetary production system. The people who control the money have a great deal of power, always have.
It's a good point that what the global financial system is doing affects inequality within countries. But for the large countries, and if we looked at, say, the United States, the little factoid you always hear is X CEO now makes 4,000 times the salary of the average worker, and it only used to be 150 times. And I always think, that's a sexy statistic, and people love to quote that, but is it really so relevant in terms of, the CEO, the C-suite, whatever they're paid, it's still a relatively very small amount of the total income of the company. So if the company overall is doing well, should we care what the CEO is making? Or, that just makes for a great quote in the back of the cover of a text, of a book.
Yeah, that's a statistic that I'm really wary of, because it generally relates to the top 400 or 500 companies. right? And there, I don't know how many thousand people who call themselves CEO in the country, but the top 400 or 500 and the top 10 are really very big. So we were looking at people whose names we know: Gates, Ellison, Zuckerberg, and so on and so forth. They where does that number come from? It comes from the valuation of the stocks that they control, Bezos and Amazon and so forth. So that's why we say that they have all of this, the multiple of because they're the capitalists. They own their own companies essentially. And what this is about the structural transformation of the American economy to where the commanding heights, which were once large industrial corporations with a very large salaried and managerial class, that the entities my father wrote about in the 1960s in the new industrial state. Now the commanding heights are relatively small companies dominated by venture capitalist software engineers and with these enormous market capitalizations, and that's that's a very great concentration of financial power and a very unstable one, and it's also exceedingly concentrated geographically. We did a little exercise in the aftermath of the internet boom in the 1990s, asking if you took out the growth of incomes across the counties that contributed most to the rise of inequality in the United States, and you can measure this stuff, how many counties would you have to take out to bring it down? The answer is 15. And how many counties would you have to take out in order to bring it down by half? The answer is 5. Which ones were they? Well, there's New York. Well, that's Wall Street. And then there are 3 counties in Northern California: Santa Clara, San Mateo, San Francisco, the Silicon Valley. 1 county in the state of Washington, King County, Seattle, Microsoft. So these were, explosions of measured income, tax income in this case, that drove up the inequality. You look out over the whole country, I think it didn't change all that much. That's not what was going on. What was going on was a structural transformation that gave finance and technology an enormous increase that other people didn't experience.
You just mentioned, and I'm almost ashamed that I didn't check it out. You said when your father wrote about this, are you related to John Kenneth Galbraith?
Yeah, surprise, surprise. Yes, that's my father.
I should have checked on that. I'm, of course, I've heard of your father.
You're the first person in the history of interviewing me who was surprised by that.
I never looked it up. I just assumed that, maybe it's just
like I've arrived.
Well, poor on me for not realizing that. I wanted to take some time, and you also wrote a book called The Poison Chalice, about Greece and what the Troika when Greece was potentially have to leave the European Union, and you explained that the Troika, so to speak, were really looking after the interests of the creditors and the banks and not of the Greek people. So are unions like that? The European Union, where it's hard to go your own way because they have to have because of the common currency. Everybody has to be within the guardrails. Is that the right way forward, the good way forward? And then and the British left, right, famously or infamously, depending on how you look at it. How is the European Union as a model? Is that a model that should be followed or changed? Or, what are your thoughts on some, a way of, I guess, managing economies that Europeans have tried to do?
Okay, just to clarify for your listeners, I became a close friend of Yanis Varoufakis in the early 2010s at the time of the European crisis, and when he became finance minister, he asked me to come to Athens, which I did immediately, and I was in and out during the 5 months of his ministry. So the book "Welcome to the Poison Chalice" is an account of those months. And it was a very eye-opening and sobering experience. The Greeks, having really experienced a colossal loss of income over 4 or 5 years of the crisis, made a decision at the start of 2015 to elect a left-wing coalition government, the Syriza coalition of the parties of the radical left, in order to try and negotiate a better deal with their European partners. And that was essentially the remit given to the finance minister. And he ran into a wall of resistance. And what was behind that? Behind that was, first of all, the power of the French and the German banks. And secondly, the extremely strong hardline position of the German government. And what was behind that was their desire to impose a policy not only on Greece, but also not only on Athens, but on Rome, on Paris, as well as on the other countries that were affected by the crisis, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. And so their position was that they could not give. And the German finance minister was very candid with us, was very blunt about this. They could not give concessions to Greece because that would entail softening their position toward everybody else. So Greece was an incidental victim, and its government got crushed. Even though the Greek people were prepared to put up a much tougher fight, eventually the government fell apart on its own. Its position fell apart from its own internal divisions and let's say subordination of some of the people who were in responsible positions. And Yanis resigned after the referendum in early July of 2015. So that was, as I say, a harsh experience, understanding that the European Union was precluding the democratic choice. It was not going to respect the democratic choice of its constituent countries, and that's been the reality essentially ever since. There has not been another, let's say, serious effort, and Yanis made a really serious effort to persuade the European Commission, the European Central Bank, the IMF, that they were on a dysfunctional track, that they were damaging the European Union itself. And as I say, their position was locked in from the beginning. So this is really very problematic when you think in terms of what kind of democratic horizon is open to the people of Europe at this point. The answer is it's not very much.
And and you can see why maybe enough for the British decide that they would forego the quote unquote cross-border advantages of being in the EU and choose to be, I suppose, at the end of the day, perhaps British. They remain British and forego the other potential benefits.
Well, at the time, I was tasked with a very small group to look into how Greece might exit the euro and potentially the European Union. Although we were hopeful that one could make a currency change. We have countries in the European Union or not in the euro. The problem is there's no real strategy, no real mechanism to go back to that status. But that was what I was tasked with looking at. It looked certainly to me like something that would have been very difficult for the Greek government to pull off under a sort of an emergency situation. In retrospect, I'm not so sure that it would have been all that difficult. The resilience of the Greek people was remarkable. Their political solidarity was remarkable. And people find ways to get around to make their economic system work and give you some time to patch up the underlying systems. Might have been possible. But at the time, I didn't say yes or no. It wasn't my job. My job was to say, if you were going to do this, these are some of the steps you would have to take, and you have to think about how much oil you have, and what you can do without. And in the end, the government was not prepared to take those steps.
It's interesting, and almost that this seems to bring us back to, what we started talking about was entropy. Is you have a system, and that system tends to atomize, and problems, come back, and you sweep them under the rug. And now you look at the 10-year yields of all the European countries, even the so-called pigs. So there's, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, I think it was. And they're all yielding below the US because we have been so profligate in our spending. So everything, at least in that regard, looks good, but things sort of atomize. And then you bring back to your very, very salient point a little bit earlier, that China survived the financial crisis because they kept control of the capital flows in their markets. And I suppose that is a lesson, a lesson that we should keep in, people would do well to keep in mind. Professor Galbraith, thank you so much for the long discussion today. Really looking forward to your next book, or maybe a more on entropy economics. Thank you so much.